question recently came up about creating a gold-plated surface on a project, and it just so happens I had some footage of me painting this Iron Man portrait onto a t-shirt, so I thought it might make a good tutorial. There are a number of different color combinations you could go with. You could even choose to use a metallic gold, although I don't think that yields a very good result if you're really looking for a simulated gold plating. But you could use a number of different color combinations to achieve this look. I am starting out with Wicked Detail Raw Sienna, which is a pretty golden shade of yellow to begin with. It's a little bit dark, and it's heavily mixed with Wicked Opaque White. It's almost a pastel looking color, as you can see it going on the shirt. And I'm using a freehand shield in order to retain some of the very sharp edges and lines on the mask of his face. But I want the very pastel, pale looking color as my initial layer, because that's what I will be building off of as we progress. And you will see me use the freehand shield multiple times along with just freehand skills during this process. It may appear as though I am just blocking in all of the gold areas. It's not only his face mask, there's also a small portion of armor on his bicep that I will be painting with this simulated gold plated look. I'm not actually just blocking all of this in. A lot of it is getting covered, but I am paying attention to my reference and building some of the highlight and shadow areas while I'm doing this. It is difficult to see, I apologize for that. It's also important to note that I am not trying to paint this exactly as I see it in the reference. I'm using the reference as a guideline, but the reference image is a little bit darker on his gold-plated face armor than I wanted to portray on this particular shirt. So it is a guideline. I'm using it for where the highlights and shadows really need to be placed, but I'm not going to try and make it exactly as I see it in the reference. So although this color is not very dark, you can still build different values through a layering process. Applying less paint will give you a lighter shade of this color, and applying more paint or more coats of paint to one area will darken it up some. And that's what I'm using to build up some of where the darker areas are going to be, as well as some of the highlights and other reflections. So our original base layer is complete at this point, and I know it's difficult to see on camera. I probably should have had the camera a little bit closer to this project while I was painting it. There are some subtle gradations in that base layer depicting where some highlights and shadows will appear. I've now switched to Wicked Detail Raw Sienna by itself. This is straight out of the bottle, with the exception that it's been reduced with 4011 reducer. I'm running it at about a 1:1 reduction ratio. This color will really brighten up our original base layer, but it can also be used for some shadows. This color will actually get relatively dark. Here you can see I'm working on a shadow for a little indention on his bicep armor, and you'll really get an idea of how dark you can actually make this color. This color is primarily going to be used for the mid-tone values, as well as some of the shadows. The shadows more on his bicep armor. I'll actually go a little bit darker on the face armor, and there you can see I'm creating a little bit of a shadow on the right side of that bicep armor with this color, because that is a rounded surface, and I want to sell the idea that it is three-dimensional and a rounded piece going around his arm. This color will be used for developing form, as you just saw with me creating that shadow, but it's also going to be used to develop some detail. Detail comes in as far as the shadow is concerned on that indention on his bicep armor. This is a transparent color, so you can use it very lightly to really make that base layer appear more of a golden hue, as you can see me doing now, or you can use it very heavily and create darker areas. I will still come back in with another color for the darkest shadows after we complete this stage of the process. And once again, I'm going to use freehand shields quite a bit, especially on the face armor, because there are a lot of very sharp edges on Iron Man's face shield that have some nice reflections, and they're very well defined in the reference image. My freehand shield is not wanting to cooperate with me there. And I'll work this up in lighter layers. You have to remember that contrast is relative. This color looks very dark compared to just the white background of the shirt at this point. You have to remember that contrast is relative. So once other colors go on, these colors will not appear quite as dark and as bright as they do at this point. You'll see that later after I've applied the red to his suit. It will actually push these two layers back a little bit. Working on some detail around the eyes now, just adding a little bit of a darker line. The eyes on his mask are inset. I'm working on some detail here, trying to portray the fact that these are well defined and a little bit deeper compared to the top forehead portion of his mask. And I'm working all of this freehand with the assistance of my freehand shields. You could easily use masking techniques or cut some stencils There are a number of ways that you could accomplish the same thing without having to rely heavily on your freehand skill if you haven't developed your skills to the level that they need to be at this point. All this is manipulating light and shadow. I'm creating darker areas for the shadows, which is building the form, and leaving some areas lighter for the highlights, which is also contributing to the form, the shape of the armor on his face, as well as the bicep. Working on outlining the top of his face mask here, and these lines are not perfect. That's okay. When the red goes on around these lines and some of the darker shadows are created in that area, this will not be noticeable. And if you pay attention, you'll probably notice that I'm trying to leave the very brightest highlighted sections of his face armor as that original base color. It's difficult to see here because I don't have the red surrounding it yet, and sometimes I have to step in front of the camera. I apologize for that. But I'm working on trying to keep those brightest reflected areas of the face mask that original base color. And those will get brighter once the red goes on. We'll even come back in later with the highlight color to really punch those out a little bit more. But for the most part, the highlights will remain that base pastel mixed color. The raw sienna is really good at developing our midtones here, as well as some of the darker areas, and not all of this will be super dark as in the reference. Like I mentioned, I'm not trying to paint this exactly as I see it. I am using it as a guide for where some of the shadows and highlights need to be, but I don't want to paint this portrait quite as dark as the reference image. I want it to be a little bit more bright, a little more vibrant, and stand out a little bit better on this t-shirt. You can really see some of the gradations I'm creating there now, where it goes from the very light base color up on the top of his armor to a little more of a golden color, and then it gets pretty dark as it gets up to the very top of the mask. And that's simply by applying paint with either less layers or more layers. That's one of the advantages to working with transparents, is you can get a lot of depth and different values with the same color. I'm even using this color to rough in the mouth. And I will continue this process until I have all of the form and some of this detail in place where I want it, and then we will move on to the next color. In the previous section, I touched on contrast, and we talked about how contrast is relative. As you can see off camera, I've gone ahead and painted in a lot of the red portions of his armor, and suddenly that wicked detail raw sienna does not appear nearly as dark as it did in the previous section. That's due to the contrast that I was talking about before. Now that we have these other colors surrounding the gold portions of his armor, it's a little more subdued. Now I've switched to Wicked Detail Raw Umber. This is the shadowing color, the primary shadowing color that I'll be using for these gold plated surfaces. This is about a 1-to-1 reduction ratio as well. It's mixed 1-to-1 with 4011 reducer. My air pressure through all of this was about 30 psi. I can use the Wicked Detail Raw Umber to really punch out some super dark areas, for example the mouth. You can see me working on that at this point. And the main reason I went ahead and defined the mouth with the raw sienna as well was because I didn't want to lose it in the overspray. So now I'm coming back over the top of that with the Wicked Detail Raw Umber, and you can see just how dark that color really is. I will actually wind up using some of this color even in the shading of the red portions of his armor. Some of you may be thinking, well, what about using a black? I am not a huge fan of using black in my artwork. There's nothing wrong with mixing black with another color in order to darken it up, but it's pretty rare that I will use just a straight black out of the bottle reduced for shading purposes. Occasionally I will, and I will actually wind up using a little bit of a black, and I mean a little bit of a black, on the gold-plated surfaces of this particular portrait. But for the most part, I avoid black because if you really look around and think about it, in nature you don't see a true black. You may see colors that appear very dark, and your mind may fool you and tell you that it's a black, but it's very rare that you will see an actual true black in nature. Black tends to gray things out. You get a much cleaner shadow or transition between light and darks if you use complementary colors or another color compared to black. So at this point I'm working more on the detail with this darker color. There will be a little bit of the form in the sense that we're going to create some of the darker shadows with this color, but primarily now we're getting into the detailed portions. You can see I'm creating some of the lines in the gaps between the little portions of the face mask armor and really creating or redefining some of these darker shadows. For the most part, my shadows are receding, meaning I'm not covering everything that we created with the raw sienna. If you do that, you're going to lose your mid-tones. So the darkest shadows are contained within what we created in that previous step. Attacking this very lightly. I don't want to go too dark too fast. That's the other reason why I decided to go ahead and paint the red portions of the armor before I began the shadowing process on the gold portions, because contrast will mess with your mind. If I had tried to do the shadows before I painted any of the red portions of the armor into this portrait, there's a pretty good chance I probably would have gone too dark, because the only thing I had to contrast it with is the white of the t-shirt. I didn't want his mask to be as dark as the reference image. I wanted to keep it quite a bit lighter. Here you can see I'm coming back down to the bicep armor and reinforcing that shadow on the right side, as well as a little bit of reflected shadows on the rest of his armor. And of course that little indentation spot, I can reinforce that shadow. But again, I'm not completely covering everything that I painted with the raw sienna previously. You can still see some of that raw sienna around and through the raw umber. There's a good straight on shot of the progress at this point. All of this is created by building layers slowly. That includes not only the gold plated surfaces, but also the rest of his armor. It's just multiple layers using different shading values to create depth, to bring life to your artwork, make it look like it's an actual three-dimensional object. Now you can really see the left highlighted portions of his mask, those really angular shapes that I was talking about in the previous section as well. How I tried to keep those with that original base layer that we created with the raw sienna and the opaque white. Now that we have some red surrounding that area, you can really see those highlights shining through. And like I said before, we will come back in with a highlight color and really punch some of those areas out a little bit farther than they are now. I'm gradually darkening up some of these sections little by little. It's a lot easier to add more paint if you need to darken something up versus remove that paint if you go too dark. When I want really fine detailed lines, I move the airbrush in very close. When I want a nicer gradation or fade, then I'll move the airbrush back just a little bit. So I'll continue working this color up to the levels and the values that I want, and then we will move on to the next step. So now that we have the darker areas established with the raw umber, I'm coming back in with Createx Wicked Opaque White to reestablish and redefine some of these highlights. I've got this color mixed at about a 2-to-1 ratio, 2 parts paint to 1 part 4011 reducer. My air pressure hasn't changed. The reason that I like the 2-to-1 ratio with the opaque is because I want the coverage. If you over reduce an opaque color, you are reducing the ability for it to cover quickly. It will still cover, but it's going to take more coats in order to get the coverage. I want to be able to cover with this white paint relatively quickly, and that's even a little bit more of a challenge when you're working on t-shirt fabric. So I chose a 2-to-1 reduction ratio. My goal here is to redefine and reestablish some of these highlights that have gotten lost with a little bit of overspray or just were never really defined well in the beginning. So I'm using the reference image as my guide for this. I'm not trying to get carried away. This is one of those times where less is definitely more. It's not terribly difficult to go in, add a bunch of highlights, and really detract from all of the work that you've done previously up to this point. Where I see the really brightest, hottest spots in the reference image is where I'm adding some of this white. And sometimes this takes a few layers to really build up the brightness. So in some of these areas I will go over the same section more than once just to really punch out that highlight. Working on some of the right edge of his gold-plated armor, and I'm going to wind up having to come back in and redefine these areas after the background goes in, but I'd like to go ahead and start defining them now. And then that left side of his armor is very bright. We've already established the very sharp angular lines with freehand shields previously. I'm not worried about using the freehand shields in order to keep those areas defined at this point. You can absolutely do that if you choose to do so. I'm concentrating my spray more in the center of that shape, really trying to make that highlight glow like it's a reflective surface. So I'm avoiding the ends. I talked about how I rarely use a straight black in my artwork, and this is one of those exceptions to that rule. I find a very small amount, and I mean a very small amount of black used on a chrome plated surface or even a gold plated surface actually works really well. I'm using Wicked Detail Smoke Black here. It's reduced about 1-to-1 with 4011 reducer, and I'm going in and adding a very small hint of this black in the very darkest shapes and shadows that I see on the face armor in this portrait. It's a very small amount. You do not want to use too much black in your art. At this point we are on the downhill slide. We are at the very last stages of this process. As you can see, I already completed the background before the previous step, and now I also have the lettering underneath the portrait, and I've come back in with the Wicked Opaque White mix. This is the same mix that we used previously. I just want to reestablish, redefine, and punch out some of these highlights as my last step. I'm really concentrating on the right side of his face where He is separated from the background. I want to make sure that those are sharp, clean, and bright, but I will also use this color in a few other areas just to punch out some of those highlights that we created earlier as well, just to brighten them up just a little bit. Again, less is more. You do not want to overdo your highlights. And that pretty much wraps up how I go about rendering a gold-plated surface. It's a relatively simple process. If you choose good colors, you will get good results. I will leave links in the description below to all of the products that I used in this demonstration. One of the links will be the Spray Gunner website. Our friends at Spray Gunner is where I purchase all of my Createx paint products, including the colors used here and the reducer, and there you see what the final result looked like. I hope you guys got something out of this. If you did, remember to like, subscribe, and share. I'm Trevor with Wicked Art Studio, and I'll see you guys next time.